Well, I think normally what I do is I'll read the entire passage and then we'll talk about it, but it's 2 whole chapters, so I'm going to break it up. If you've got a handout, you've got five points. Five, okay. How many points? Am I on? Yeah, is that better? I feel like I have to swallow this thing. Is that better? How about now? Can you hear me now? How about now? How about now? No. Okay. Don't worry, that'll get cut off the live stream when I put it up there. I almost feel like going back to the lapel mic. I don't know. All right, is that better? Okay. Now I see this. It's right there at the edge of my vision. I could just see it dangling there. It's like I want to swat it like a fly. All right. Genesis 39. It's like, do we come here for a Bible study or a stand-up routine? It's a Bible study, trust me. Genesis 39. You've got 5 parts there. Just to set the stage, obviously we've been going through the book of Genesis where if you haven't been here at all, I'm not going to go through an entire overview of what we've gone through, but Genesis really breaks down into 2 major sections. You've got Genesis 1 through 11, which is often referred to as primeval history, and then Genesis 12 through 50, which is the history of the patriarchs. And then within those 2 big parts, you've got smaller subparts, which are often indicated by the phrase, which it's hard to determine in the New King James because the New King James changes the wording of it. But if you have something like an ESV or something like that, you might see, and these are the generations of. The way the New King James puts it, it says, this is the history of, this is the genealogy of. It's the same word in Hebrew. The word in Hebrew is toledot, and it just literally means, and these are the generations of. And that's the smaller breakdown of Genesis. And it traces this passage of time from the beginning when God created all things and carried it along through the early history of creation and the fall, and then you've got the flood, and then you've got the confusion of the languages at Babel, and then you've got the history of the patriarchs. And it's taking us all the way up to the time where the people of Israel will come into the land of Egypt. And the reason why this is here is because Moses is writing this to a people who are about to enter into the promised land that he had promised to their forefathers centuries ago. So before they can go in and do what God has wanted them to do, they need to know where they've come from. They came from these 3 great patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what we're doing now is we're in the familiar story. You know, you probably know this story as a kid. It was probably told to you in Sunday school. If you were like me and you grew up with, anybody here remember flannel graphs? Okay, because you probably taught Sunday school using, no? Flannel graphs, basically it's a little board. You put these little things on there and they'd stick to the board and little pictures. I remember that as a kid. Joseph, right? Because Joseph had the coat of many colors. But what we see here is a testament to God's faithfulness as God is with Joseph. We're going to see that in Genesis 39. 3 times the narrative mentions, and the Lord was with him, even though all these bad things are happening to Joseph. Well, what bad things? Well, that was last time. If you were here last time, well, 2 times ago really, Joseph's brothers conspired to have Joseph killed. Why? Because Joseph was Jacob's favorite. Joseph had these dreams in which his brothers and his parents would be bowing down before him. And of course, his brothers, being brothers, didn't take that too kindly. So they conspired to have him killed. And instead of having him killed, then Judah, the 4th oldest, said, why should we have his blood on our hands? Let's sell him. Let's make a little profit off this thing. So they decide to sell him into slavery. Then last time, we saw the story of Judah and Tamar. It feels like it's a break in the narrative, but really it isn't. Because Judah is going to get to the point later on in the narrative where he stands in and steps up and comes through for not only Joseph, but also his younger brother, Benjamin. In fact, when Benjamin is required to go back to Egypt as a token of the faithfulness of the brothers, Jacob doesn't want to let him go, and Judah says, I will be a pledge for his life. So, but how did Judah get there? Because how does Judah go from, I'm going to sell my brother into slavery, to, I'm going to be a pledge for my younger brother's life? How does he make that change? That's what Genesis 38 is there for, to show you how Judah, who was confronted with his own sin, begins to realize that perhaps he's not everything he thought he was. So you've got that whole issue with Judah and Tamar. Now, even though it's only one chapter in the book of Genesis, it covers a span of time of about 20 years. That what happens in Genesis 38 with Judah and Tamar is running concurrent with what we're going to see now as Joseph is in slavery in Egypt to the point where he is elevated to the right hand of Pharaoh. So all of this is happening while Judah is having this thing going on in the land of Canaan. But we're going to pick up the story of Joseph. The last time we saw him, he was sold, as it says here, to a guy named Potiphar, an officer in Pharaoh's guard and a captain of the guard. You saw that. We see that in the end of 37, chapter 37, verse 36. The Midianites sold Joseph into Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. And now we pick up again in Genesis 39. So we're going to look at the first part here, Joseph in Egypt, which is the first 6 verses. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Now farmers, wouldn't you like to have a guy like Joseph in your house? A guy who, just by his mere presence, blesses everything in the house and everything in the field, right? You know, that seems like a pretty good deal. All right. So as I said last time in Genesis 38, we saw how the Lord was molding the character of Judah, exposing his sin and bringing him to the end of himself. All that, while that's happening, here we see that Joseph has been sold into slavery in Egypt, and he starts to prosper in the house of Potiphar, and not just himself, but because of his prospering, it brings blessing to the house of Potiphar. And what we see here immediately in verse 2 is a theme that is going to carry us really through the rest of the Genesis narrative, really. But it comes very prominently here in Genesis 39, that it says in verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. And we know this because immediately what we see is everything that Joseph had, everything that Joseph touched, was blessed of the Lord. Joseph found favor in the sight of the Lord, and because of that, Joseph found favor in the sight of Potiphar. Potiphar elevated him to being second in command, to the point where it says here that because of everything that had happened with Joseph, everything was prospering in his hand, that Potiphar, it says here, he didn't even know what he had except for the bread that he ate. He put everything into Joseph's care. It's like, I don't want to keep track of any of it. You keep track of it. Everything seems to be going aces with you, Joseph. You run everything. I'll just sit back and reap the rewards of all of this. So he made him overseer of his house and entrusts everything to Joseph. And then you get this little thing here at the end in verse 6, which doesn't seem to tie in with what we just read, but it will play a larger part in a moment. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Okay. Genesis does this a lot, where it mentions a fact or a situation, and you're like, what does this have to do with anything? And then you read a few verses later, oh, that's what it, we saw this when Rebekah was mentioned way before she was betrothed to Isaac. We just saw a little genealogy of some guy named Bethuel, who was Abraham's nephew. And it's like, well, who cares that he gave birth to a woman named Rebekah? And then you find out, oh, that's right, she's going to become the wife of Isaac. Now, we know this story, but if you're reading this for the first time, you have to try to put your mindset in the frame of mind of someone hearing this for the first time. It's like, why do I care what Joseph looked like? Well, we're going to care because Mrs. Potiphar cared what Joseph looked like, right? That's what we're going to see in a moment. Now, what we see here happening with Joseph is what we've seen in several occasions so far with the patriarchs. It's that the Lord blesses the life of the patriarch, and that has sort of like a spillover effect to whoever is associated with that person. So we first see this with Abraham in Genesis 21, verse 22, where this is Abraham making a covenant with Abimelech. And it came to pass at the time that Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me and with my offspring or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I've done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelt. So Abraham is dwelling in this land, borrowed land, if you will, and this guy realizes that Abraham is being blessed greatly, so he's like, hey, let's make a covenant, and so I can get in on some of this action that you seem to be blessed with. This happened with Isaac later on, same guy, a different Abimelech, but in Genesis 26, verse 28, again, Abimelech came down and started talking to Isaac, and they said, we have certainly seen that the Lord is with you. So he said, let there now be an oath between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you. We saw this with Jacob, when Jacob was tending Laban's flocks, right? The Lord blessed everything Jacob had done, and Laban's flocks grew and multiplied greatly because Jacob was there. So we see this pattern of the Lord blessing the patriarch, and then that blessing kind of spilling over, having an effect to the people that he's dealing with. In this case, Potiphar, in the case of Joseph. Now, if you remember way back in Genesis chapter 12, when God called Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees, he said, I will surely bless you, and you will be a blessing, and those who bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed, and you will be a blessing, and through you all the families of the earth will be blessed. We see, in a sense, a partial fulfillment of this. Now, we know that is ultimately fulfilled in Christ. Christ is the seed of Abraham, and he is the one through whom the world is blessed. But we see a partial fulfillment here as wherever the patriarchs go, they are being a blessing to those around them. And here we see that as well. This is a blessing which is part of the promise that God made with Abraham back in Genesis 12. And we see here also that Jacob is, in a sense, in exile, and he is experiencing blessing even while in exile, which is kind of important to note, because if you remember when we went through 1 Peter, we talked about how the church is considered to be exiles and sojourners, and that language comes from the Old Testament. The idea of a sojourner comes from the life of Abraham himself. Abraham sojourned in a land that was not his own. And the church, we are sojourners. We are like Abraham in that sense, sojourning in a land that is promised to us but hasn't been fully given to us. Same thing with exile. The Israelites were exiled into Babylon. We too are, in a sense, are living as exiles as the church. And it is through the church that blessing comes to the world, right? How so, you may ask? Well, because it is through the church that the means of grace are administered. It is through the church that the gospel is proclaimed. It is through the church that people receive salvation, through the proclamation of the gospel. And that is indeed God showering the blessings that he promised to Abraham through Christ to the world by means of the church. Okay? So here we see this idea of Joseph in Egypt. He's being blessed. The Lord is with him, even though he's away from home, even though he's sold as a slave. The Lord is with him and blesses everything under his hand. Well, no good deed goes undone. And no sooner do we learn of Joseph's rise to prominence in Potiphar's house that we see here in verse 7. And it came to pass after these things, the things that we just talked about in verses 1 through 6, that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." So here's Mrs. Potiphar pursuing handsome in form and appearance Joseph. Okay? So she cast longing eyes on Joseph. Now, here's where we see a little bit of the comparison and contrast with his older brother Judah. Judah didn't really have much integrity in the sense of sexual ethics, right? When his wife dies, well, first of all, he kind of just takes a wife, and then we're never told her name. And then when the wife dies, he goes and comforts himself in the arms of what he thought was a prostitute. Well, here Joseph shows a little bit more moral integrity, right? By refusing Mrs. Potiphar's advances. Verse 8, he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness?" And note, and sin against God, right? Yes, sin against Potiphar, but ultimately, right, isn't all sin just ultimately sin against God? That's what David said in his Psalm of Penitence in Psalm 51. He says, "Against you, O Lord, against you only have I sinned and done what is wicked in your sight." Well, yeah, but he did sin against Uriah. Yeah, he had him killed. He did sin against his own wives by committing adultery. Yeah. But against the Lord, right? Because all sin ultimately is sin against God. And Joseph here recognizes this. How can I do this great wickedness and sin, yes, against Potiphar, but ultimately against God? Now, unfortunately, right, this is not like Mrs. Potiphar said, "Well, you're right, Joseph. You're right. I shouldn't have made this proposition to you. We'll call it good." No, this is not a one-time occurrence, right? This happens over and over and over again. Verse 10, so it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day. Can you imagine being Joseph? It's like, get away from me. But day by day, right? Lie with me, lie with me. He's like, no. Day by day that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. Then verse 11, but it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside. To verse 12, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that she had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me. And so it happened as I lifted up my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled outside." So Joseph so far has done everything right? I mean, from a worldly perspective. He's served his master honorably. When the wife begins making advances, he refuses her. Day by day, he refuses her. When they're caught alone, Joseph does what the scripture says and flees sexual immorality, or he literally runs away, leaving his garment behind. But as the old saying goes, right, there's no fury like that of a woman scorned, right? There is hell hath no fury than like a woman scorned. And Mrs. Potiphar here is not going to continue to hold, she's going to have the last word here. So she falsely accuses him. She falsely accuses him. So this gives her the opportunity to falsely accuse against Joseph with Potiphar. And notice the language here too is kind of reminiscent of Genesis 3 when God confronts Adam and Eve with their sin. What did Mrs. Potiphar say to Potiphar? The Hebrew slave which you brought. In other words, it's your fault. It's your fault, husband, that you brought this man in here and so on and so forth to mock me, right? That's what Adam said. Well, the woman you gave me, right? She gave me the fruit. And then Eve says, well, the snake that you put in the garden, he tempted me. We always seem to cast the blame. Doesn't seem fair, right? It doesn't seem fair. You could do everything right and still be falsely accused. Joseph's only crime from the scripture's point of view here is that he was good looking. Right? That was his only crime here, that he was good looking and then refused the advances of his master's wife. Now, I want you to note some of the language here too. Okay, you've got language of coincidence. It came to pass, and so it was, and but it happened. Now that's normal Hebrew way of writing narrative. Usually, really, Hebrew narrative is, and this happened, and that happened, and that happened. It's just kind of a series of events. But it's like, and so it happened, or it came to pass. It makes it sound like it's coincidence, like everything is just kind of happening outside of Joseph's control. But really, who's in control here? The Lord's in control, right? We just saw earlier, verse 2. Who was with Joseph? The Lord was with Joseph. Well, if the Lord's with Joseph, why is this happening? Well, it's because the Lord is with Joseph that this is happening, okay? That's the point we need to understand. This is not happening outside of the Lord's control. It's not like the Lord's like, I'm with you, Joseph. I just can't control that woman. Sorry, you're on your own. No, the Lord is with Joseph even through all of this. These are not accidental occurrences. The hand of God is working here in this situation. Now, it may not seem like it. It may not seem like the Lord is with Joseph. It may seem like the Lord has abandoned Joseph and left him to suffer this false accusation. But the Lord is with Joseph. He is with Joseph, even though it may not seem like it. Okay. Well, moving along then to verses 19 through the rest of the chapter. Joseph is now in prison. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So again, you got this, and the Lord was with him. It's like, yeah, but he was just falsely accused and thrown into prison. And the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him through all of this. Through all of this, the Lord is with him. Now, I'm a little surprised. Are you a little surprised that Potiphar just kind of immediately, listened to the accusations of... Maybe Potiphar's like, I don't want to get on Mrs. Potiphar's bad side. Whatever you say, honey. Okay, I'll throw him in prison if that's what you want. I'm sure Potiphar's like, yeah, but everything's been going so well around here. It's like, can we just overlook this one thing? It's like, so I guess you can say that, she had a little sway over him as well. His anger was aroused. Now, of course, no one likes to hear that, someone's been messing around in your rhubarb, right? So he's probably like, I trusted you with everything, Joseph, but my wife was off limits, and, so he believed this wife. He didn't even think twice about it. He didn't even think to hear Joseph's side of the story. He just throws him into prison. And again, we're told, as I said the second time, that the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And again, Joseph is given favor in the sight of the prison guard. And just like with Potiphar, this guy, he rose into prominence. He achieved a position of authority within the prison. there. And everything that this prison guard had, he committed to Joseph because everything was going swimmingly as long as Joseph was in control. So he was trusted with everything in the prison because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Now, I'm sure, as we'll see in the next chapter, in chapter 40, I don't think Joseph was just sitting around here being stoic. Saying, well, I guess this is my lot in life. I'm sure he was probably like, man, this stinks. He's like, I did everything right. Look, I'm in prison. I was my father's favorite. My brothers hated me and wanted to kill me and sold me into slavery. And then I was trying to make the best of a bad situation, and I got falsely accused. At least, that would probably be me. If I were Joseph, that's probably how I would be thinking about it. But notice how he continued to trust in the Lord who provided for him, in which the Lord did. And I think what we see here is an example of, the adage, bloom where you're planted, right? I want to look at 1 Corinthians 7. It's not a direct connection, but it's, you can make an indirect connection here. In 1 Corinthians 7, verses 17 through 24. If you've got headings in your Bible, you might have a heading there that says, live as you are called. The greater context is marriage in the church there in Corinth. And the issue that Paul is addressing is believers aren't sure whether they should marry at all. And if they're converted and their spouse isn't converted, they're wondering, should I stay married with my spouse? And they had a whole bunch of questions on marriage. And Paul, the entire chapter, which is a long chapter, is devoted to trying to address some of those issues. But one of the things he gets in here in verses 17 through 23, or 24, is this. But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not be uncircumcised. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. But keeping the commandment of God is what matters. This is the verse I really want to get at. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You are bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. The point Paul is making there is, look, because of the times that we're in, bloom where you're planted. Don't try to get out of a certain situation in order to think because you might be getting into a better situation. If you're a slave, serve the Lord as a slave. Now, if you can obtain your freedom, by all means, obtain your freedom. But serve where you're planted. And in a sense, that's kind of what Joseph is doing here, isn't he? Yeah, he's been given a bit of a raw deal, and I'm sure he's probably not happy about it. But what we see here is that he is making the best of a bad situation. He is here in the house of the prison guard, and he is blooming, in a sense, where he's been planted. And again, remember, the Lord is with him. We saw it again at the end of this chapter. The Lord was with him. It's the theme of chapter 39 and going into 40 and the rest. Even though Joseph doesn't quite see what the Lord is doing. Now, we're going to see later on, when you get to like chapter 45 and then chapter 50, Joseph is going to say, I saw how the Lord was working in all of this. I saw what the Lord was doing. I know you meant this for evil, and I know I experienced a whole ton of evil in my life, but the Lord was working it for good. And the Lord is here working it for good. And I think it's good for us to keep that in mind. I don't know what's going on in specific details in each of your lives, whether you're going through a trial right now or something like that, but know that the Lord is working in that trial. And it doesn't mean that, well, it means that everything is going to come up roses for me on the other end of it. It may not. Right? It may not come up roses for you. But the point is that the Lord is working. And when we go through these trials, what is, when James says, count it all joy when you face trials of various kinds, it's not, oh, I'm going through these trials, I'm just so joyful, I'm so happy, and I'm going to have that's not what he's talking about. Like I said, I don't think Joseph is walking around with a fake little Joel Osteen grin slapped on his face, pretending to be happy, okay? Joseph is probably a little ticked at times about what's going on. But he's like, okay, I'm going to trust the Lord in this. And the point is that these trials that the Lord brings into our lives serve multiple purposes. First thing it does is it gets us to have the right perspective of what's going on in the world around us, right? If we get a little too caught up in what's going on in the world around us and we start getting a little too comfortable living in the world around us, sometimes these trials come in and it's like, the Lord's like, you need to feel a little more uncomfortable with the world, okay? Because as a Christian, you are an alien. You are a sojourner. You are a stranger in a strange land, in a sense, such that you shouldn't feel quite at home in this world. You should always feel like maybe just a little bit off in this world, because that's how we are as Christians. The other thing he's strengthening our faith, right? That's what James says. The trials produce endurance. Endurance produces steadfastness. And steadfastness then produces completion or maturity in Christ. So that's why we count it joy, not because of the trial, but because of what it produces, the fruit that it produces in our lives. Well, let's move on to chapter 40. And the first 7 verses here, as we see Joseph with the butler, the baker, the butcher, and this candlestick maker, and all those guys, okay? So first 7 verses of chapter 40. And it came to pass, after these things, after Joseph being thrown into prison again, that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. Do you think that was a coincidence? No. Okay. Verse 4, and the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, so they were in custody for a while. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, why do you look so sad today? We'll stop there. So you get this more coincidental language here at the beginning of chapter 40. And it came to pass. And then all of a sudden it just happened that the chief butler and the chief baker were put into the prison where Joseph was. And it just so happened that the prison guard said, hey, Joseph, why don't you look after the chief butler and the chief baker? And if you believe all of this is coincidence, I've got a bridge to sell you, right, in Brooklyn. No. These 2 men were put into the position they were in to meet with Joseph because the Lord is going to speak through these men, right? And Joseph is going to be the one who's going to interpret the dreams that they had. So they had these dreams, and they're sad. Now, why are they sad? Well, they don't know what God is saying to them. They don't know what the dream means. Have you ever had those kind of dreams? You're just like, you wake up, you're like, what in the heck did I just dream? It's like, what is going on? Why was that going? If you can even remember them at all. Well, these are dreams that are given by God, so I would imagine they can remember them in pretty good detail. Now, we'll get to the dreams in a moment. But again, notice how the narrator, how Moses is setting all this up. All these things appear to be coincidences that are happening in Joseph's life, but they are carefully orchestrated events because the Lord, again, was with Joseph. And this will all work out for good in the Lord's timing. That's the part that always trips us up, right? In the Lord's timing. I want it to work out good for me like yesterday. The Lord's like, no, I've got the longer view. It's like, well, how long, Lord? Well, really long. It's like, well, can you give me a hint? It's like, yeah, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is, that's a little too long, Lord. It's like, the Lord's got the long view of these things oftentimes. So now we finish off here with Joseph, the interpreter of dreams, verses 8 through 23. So why are you so sad? And they said to him, we each have a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. Gee, wasn't it just lucky that they got put in the same prison where Joseph was? I mean, Joseph just had some dreams a few years ago, right? Isn't that just luck? No. Again, God is working. The Lord was with Joseph. We had a dream, and no one could interpret them. So Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, behold, in my dream, a vine was before me. And in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into this dungeon. Now the chief baker's like, ooh, do me, right? It's like, that one turned out good for the butler. Do me. So when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. Now, if I had that dream, I'm not sure I would think that was a good dream. Birds eating bread out of a basket on my head, that doesn't sound good, okay? And it turns out it's not going to be good. So Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Ugh. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday. Should we get him pizza? What do you think? Sorry. Pharaoh doesn't get pizza. It was Pharaoh's birthday. Then he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed a cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So here we have the climax, at least, of this part of the story. And it comes down to the interpretation of these 2 dreams. Now, again, notice how Joseph gives credit to God. This is almost like what happened with Daniel. If you remember in Daniel chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar had the dream, and he called all of his fortune tellers, all of his wise men, all of his magicians, and of course, they needed to be told the dream so they can give the interpretation. And Nebuchadnezzar caught on to them. It's like, you tell me the dream first and then give me its interpretation. And they're like, no one's ever told us to do that before. No one can do that. It's like, okay, well then off with your heads. And Daniel's like, let me have a crack at it. And he says, look, God gives the interpretation, right? Daniel's not anybody special. Joseph's not anyone special. God is the one who is speaking to these 2 men through this dream, and then gives Joseph the ability to interpret it. So the interpretations come from God. Now, each dream here foretold the fate of the individual who had the dream. So the chief butler, his dream was good. The chief baker, his dream, not so good. Okay, but it involved 3 days, which happened to come out on Pharaoh's birthday. And then in verses 20 to 23, we see the fulfillment of these 2 dreams as the chief butler was restored and the chief baker was hanged. But unfortunately, as seems to be the case with Joseph so far in these 2 chapters, he does the right thing, and then bad results happen to him. He gets forgotten, right? He begged the chief butler, it's like, look, when you get back in Pharaoh's good graces, put in a good word for me, please. Get me out of this place. I'm here I'm here for no good reason. I've been falsely accused. I've been stolen from home. I've been sold into slavery. Can you do me a solid? Look, I interpreted your dream. I gave you what the Lord had given me to say to you. Please remember me. And of course, we find out that the chief butler forgot Joseph. Now, again, with all this, we might be tempted to think, well, it's just not fair. Joseph, again, he's doing everything right, and he's not being rewarded for it. It's not fair what's happening to Joseph. But remember what the theme of this narrative is. Who is with Joseph? The Lord is with Joseph, right? The Lord is working something here. Everywhere Joseph goes, doesn't matter if it's Potiphar's house, doesn't matter if it's in the prison with the chief prison keeper, or as we'll see in the remaining chapters, he's going to be elevated to Pharaoh's right hand. And guess what's going to happen there? The Lord's going to bless him while he's at Pharaoh's right hand as well. This is all the Lord's doing, all of it. It's not because Joseph is good or praiseworthy or anything. This is all the Lord's doing. And we need to remember the greater narrative here, right? It's not just, oh, we wish that something good would happen to Joseph. What is God doing through all of this? He's working out salvation, right? The promise that was given way back in Genesis 3:15, when Adam and Eve mucked things up in the garden, when they failed to keep God's commandment, and God brought the curse that he said would come when they failed to do what he said, he said, look, I'm going to show you grace because I'm going to make a promise to you. And that promise is that the seed of the woman is going to come and is going to crush the head of the serpent. I'm going to put enmity between your seed and his seed, but he will crush his head, and the serpent will bruise the heel of the seed of the woman. All of this is to bring salvation about. All of this is that when Israel gets into Egypt through Moses, what's God going to do? He's going to save them through the mighty works that he's going to do in Egypt with the plagues and deliver them out of Egypt through the Red Sea into the Promised Land. And you're like, that's great. But that's not just the whole story, right? That's the picture. As great as that deliverance and salvation is, that's just a picture of what we're going to see Jesus do when Jesus is on the cross and he conquers the Red Sea, as it were, as he crushes the head of the serpent, as he delivers a people out of bondage, not in slavery in Egypt, but in bondage to sin, in bondage to despair, in bondage to judgment. We are under God's wrath for our sin. And Jesus, who is a better Moses, is going to deliver us from that. And this is everything that I just said is what God is doing through the life of Joseph here. Joseph is going to be in Egypt so that God's people can be in Egypt and he can deliver them, which will then point to a greater deliverance that we're going to see with Jesus Christ himself. All of that is mentioned when Stephen, you remember good old Stephen in the book of Acts? Chapter 6, or 7, I should say. Stephen mentions this. Now, Stephen was one of the 6 that were called and laid hands on to help the apostles. They were called deacons. If you want to call them deacons, that's fine. And in chapter 6, he's doing mighty works, and he's preaching, and he's proclaiming, and he's confounding everyone who comes up to him. And he calls them stiff-necked people. and they get angry at him, right? And then he has this long speech in chapter 7 in which he goes through the entire history of God's people. Right? It's like sometimes you can almost say, like, you should read the Old Testament, but there are some sections of the New Testament, it's like you almost don't need to read the Old Testament because it gives you a summary of the Old Testament. But look at verses 9 and 10 of chapter 7. And the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. Hey, that seems like what happened in Genesis 39. And delivered him out of all of his troubles and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. And all that's going to go on until he gets to Jesus, right, at the end of his little speech. And then says, at the end in chapter 7, verse 51, you stiff-necked people. That's a way to win friends and influence people, right? You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears. You always resist the Holy Spirit, as your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who foretold the coming of the just one, of whom you have now become betrayers and murderers, who have received the law by direction of angels and have not kept it. Stephen traces the entire history of God's people and mentions Joseph. But all of it, as I said, it's showing you how everything that's happening to Joseph is just one little thread in this enormous tapestry that God is weaving of salvation, which when you look at it from a distance, right, if anybody's done needlework and such, right, if you were to look real closely at like a tapestry or whatever, all you would see just like little threads, right? But when you step back far enough, you're like, oh, now I see what the picture is, right? And that's kind of what's happening here. You just see this little thing here with Joseph in Egypt, and then you realize it's like, oh, but wait, in all of this, God is working salvation. He's just carrying his plan of salvation along, and it's a wonderful thing as God is with Joseph, and God is going to be with Moses, and God is going to be with David, and God is going to be with all of the prophets, and God is going to be with the Lord, and the Lord is with the church because the Holy Spirit is in the church, and the Lord is with us, as Jesus said, and lo, I am with you always until the end of the age, right? Isn't that what Jesus says in the Great Commission? The Lord is with us. The Lord is with us, just as he is with Joseph here. As Psalm 23:4 says, he is with us even through the dark valleys, right? Even though I go through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. It would be wonderful if the Lord said, don't go there, that's a dark valley. It's like, don't go down that road. Instead, he's like, no, we're going to go down this road, but guess what? I'm going to go with you. I'm going to go with you, and I will guard you, and I will lead you out. And what comes on the other side of that dark valley? There is the feast, right? The table. He sets the table before me in the presence of my enemies. He anoints my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Let's stop there.